Hello, everyone, and welcome. We will just give folks a minute to assemble, and then we'll get started. All right, my clock says 12:31, so I reckon we might get going. So welcome again, and thanks to everyone for joining us. My name's Peter Duffy, and my colleague you can see there, Paul Minter. And we're looking forward to spending the next hour with you chatting about lessons in risk management and perhaps the journey from that gets you to cutting edge risk management. A little bit firstly about Battleground and then myself before I invite Paul to introduce himself. So Battleground, and apologies to those who've been at other sessions this week and have heard this before. But we're a consultancy that regards ourselves as being about all things risk and resilience. That's risk in the financial sector, that's risk in the non-financial sector, so enterprise risk, operational risk, but also in the resilience domain through crisis management, business continuity management, business continuity planning, and the like. So the full range of risk and resilience activities, all supported by our software that supports both those endeavours. My personal story is I've been with Battleground coming up 4 years now in different risk and resilience roles. Prior to that, I was a client for a long time of Battleground and its predecessor firms, and principally our founder, Craig Goldberg. So he and I have worked in that client-consultant relationship, and now that's become a collegiate relationship, which I'm very much enjoying. And so, as I say, my work focuses around both enterprise risk and resilience. A additional snippet about me in terms of, I suppose, what drives my passion for risk management. My understanding of risk management is beyond the frameworks and the theories and the processes. Is a fairly profound lived experience around enterprise risk management. And for some of you with a few more years on the clock on this call, you might recall Ansett Airlines, which was a very significant domestic and somewhat international airline in Australia over 20 years ago. Some of you may have read about Ansett Airlines. I was there and lived firsthand the demise of Ansett Airlines, and that's been a very, very instructive experience in my risk management journey. And we may well touch on a couple of vignettes from those olden days as we progress through the discussion today. But enough about me. Let me pass over to my colleague, Paul.
Thanks, Pete. I will dive into my intro just briefly, but before then, I thought maybe a bit of housekeeping rules.
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, if you could just tee us up with those, that'd be great.
Yes, just a couple of things. We've got splendid numbers on this call. We're in the 80s and climbing, according to my ticky here. But we would like to be as interactive as we can within that large cohort. So please feel free to utilize the chat function for questions as we go, and equally, please feel free to utilize the digital hand raise as we go. We're very, very welcoming of questions throughout the course of the presentation, but we will also leave time for questions at the end. Thanks, Paul.
Lovely stuff. Thank you, Pete. So where Pete has a long history in the resilience space and in the let's call it the real industries, I've more of a background in the financial services world and in the risk space. So we kind of come as a bit of a pair. I've been with Battleground not long. Previously, I was in APRA. I was in the non-financial risk team at the financial services regulator. So APRA is the prudential supervisor for banks, insurers, and superannuation funds. So naturally for them is an appreciation of financial risk. So thinking liquidity and credit and market and so on. But I was in the non-financial risk team there. And so we were somewhat the odd ones out, but that meant we spent a lot of time thinking about the real risks that are reflective of the things that go wrong beyond spreadsheets. And that's where we're going to draw a lot of today's lessons from. So it's the non-financial risk management case study that we're going to look into. And the lessons are going to be drawn from the cutting edge of the financial services non-financial risk management I saw during my time at APRA. So part of my role was not day-to-day supervision. I wasn't the guy that spent a lot of time with different organizations, but I was more of a specialist team behind the scenes that would go and do a deep dive for those that were particularly in trouble. As a result, I saw a lot of the inner workings of some high-performing and in the majority, low-performing risk management functions. And it's from those points we're going to draw our lessons today with regards to risk management. And the reason we feel these are a bit more applicable was because it was non-financial risk sector, or the non-financial risk elements that were leaned on in those. But I wouldn't say that non-financial risk means there's no money to be lost. So on screen, you can see a quote from the APRA chairman, which demonstrates that though things do start in the non-financial risk world, often their outcomes are very financial in nature. And that looks like loss of customer, loss of revenue, loss of license sometimes, the license to operate and earn money, and also direct fines and remediation. So non-financial risk starts in that space, but soon becomes distinctly financial in nature. But what we're going to talk through today are very much the cutting edge risk management practices in non-financial risks that are applicable, agnostic to risk type and to industry. So hopefully we can all take something away. But again, as Pete mentioned, please come with questions as we go, because that will make it more of an interactive session and less of a speech. I will point out we're not going to get quite into the bleeding edge. So cutting edge versus bleeding edge. It'll be very tempting to talk about AI doing this and predictive analytics doing that. We're going to leave a little bit of the bleeding edge for discussion, but keep to the cutting edge, which is the parts that you need to get to the bleeding edge. We are going to start with a case study, however, and they're going to root a lot of the conversation today in this case study. So this is all public knowledge. I'm just going to translate what I've read in the newspapers about this case study into the lessons and points of discussion for today. So last year, there was a cash machine in a Sydney casino that ended up giving away just over $3 million for free. Not a great start. The publicly reported reasons for that was a glitch in software. So these ATMs were almost like an electronic teller, whereby you have your voucher, which you can see in the picture here, determining what money you won at your various roulette table or slots or whatever it may be. And you take that to your electronic teller, barcode is scanned, gives you your cash, and you go home happy. Or if the casino's happier, you go to the restaurant and spend it there. There was an investigation last year that found that these machines have been giving away free money, and it cost the casino in consideration just over $3 million. And what we're going to dive into here is what was the simple matters of control failures that got them there, but more importantly, the flow of information from those failures and then the remediation and speed of it since. So just a little bit more detail on this. So gamblers discovered that you could feed in more than one voucher at the same time. The barcode of all of them will be scanned. You get your money for all of the vouchers, but the voucher at the top of your pile was the only one that was considered red. So if you put 4 in, you'd get the money for all 4, but 3 would still remain valid. So it didn't take long for people to realize there was a great big scam to be had here. Free cash was available. Tell your friends. And so over the period of 6 weeks, just over 3 mil was withdrawn in this nature. Problem is, it was only in the last 2 weeks that 3 mil was withdrawn. So there's a 6-week open goal, essentially. It took gamblers a few weeks to realize, and it was only in the last 2 weeks that they managed to clamp down on the activity. And the problem being is the daily reconciliation in those tellers between the voucher input and the cash output was being performed, but not being sent on. The data wasn't going to the right spot. So even though the control was somewhat working, the information flow wasn't. And as a result, it took another route to being discovered, which was suspicious activity and monitoring of CCTV, before this enormous $3 million problem was found. And so what we're going to get back to is a way of understanding this in terms of the risk management processes that should have been there, and kind of what could have been different had that been up and running properly. Again, I'm working off public information. There may be someone on the call with a bit more knowledge and info, but the lessons we draw will be very similar. And so I mentioned a difference between the bleeding edge and the cutting edge. But one thing I noticed during my time at APRA and looking at some of the largest financial institutions in the country, is that those at the cutting edge, and I put that at about 1 in every 10 that I deep dived into, didn't do anything amazingly fantastic. But what they did do was the basics extremely well. And we've got a different quote on screen now. It's not from a regulator, it's not from APRA, it's from a guy called Michael Jordan. And he said in full, you can practice shooting 8 hours a day, but if your technique is wrong, then all you become is very good at shooting the wrong way. Get the basics down, and the level of everything you do will rise. So what we're going to look at in this conversation today is, what does the getting the basics down look like in financial services? What did I see in terms of the best performers there? And then what can they translate and be taken away from into your conversations tomorrow at work? And there's approximately 4 tenets, and we'll go through those 4 tenets now. The number 1, a shared language around risk. Number 2, trusted data. Number 3, fearless honesty. And number 4, decisive action. And we'll go through those now. I will pause for a moment in case there are any questions, either raised hands or in the chat.
And while you're just pausing there, Paul, and we reflect on the basics, and people might be shaking their heads if they're unfamiliar with the story of the overly generous cash machine. But in a similar vein, when I mentioned the demise of Ansett that I observed firsthand all those years ago, one of many risk factors that was poorly managed and played out very badly was around the simple management of notifications from aircraft managers around preventative maintenance. And long story short, Ansett had a fleet of Boeing 767 aircraft. They were the oldest, some of the oldest examples of that type in the world at that time. There was a very straightforward maintenance order from the manufacturer to check the structural integrity of engine cowlings on those aircraft. The process was such that one individual interpreted that as not being relevant to the Ansett fleet. There were no other processes of checking, no other processes of challenge. There were no assurance processes applied. And as a consequence, some months later, that subfleet was grounded, operationally the airline was massively impacted in the immediate term, but more particularly fatally impacted in terms of travellers' confidence in the long term. So there's a myriad of these examples that we can talk about as reference points.
Thanks, Pete. Great one from the non-financial risk space into the, well, we can't earn revenue, so a direct financial impact. So I mentioned the beginning is shared language. And this is going to be very much the basics, which may feel a bit of an ajar with the cutting edge title we have to our presentation. But in all honesty, I'm going to underline the message that we heard, or some of you may have heard from Peter Taylor, the RMIA Risk Leader of the Year, which is simplicity is king. And with simplicity and a shared language and a shared understanding, the rest can come. So I'm going to really step through where we saw in APRA the best sense of understanding that propelled the risk function forwards in both its application and its credibility. And I'll return to the credibility point later. So very much at the start, we have a stick figure on the left representing the company, and we have the money on the right representing the goal. So being clear on your objectives that support your goal is step one. You then need to, as this example demonstrates, walk towards your goal. You need to implement the processes that achieve making that money. So this would be in the risk parlance, the process. Unfortunately, in the process of achieving your goals, there are hidden dangers. Some things can go wrong, represented here by the pit in front of the man between him and the money, which we'll commonly label as the risk. One fault we saw is a lot of people start their conversations here at the risk layer. That brings problems later in that you completely disregarded both goals and processes, which begins to cost you your credibility as a risk function with the business. The more you talk about risk, absent goals and processes, the less you're invited back to those conversations. Next up is, I want to mitigate this risk. I don't want it to happen. Or if it does happen, I don't want it to be too bad. In the common parlance, you control. You're controlling for the risk. And in our little example here, we have the bridge. But unfortunately, the bridge isn't working too well. It's not doing its job. The control has a functional problem or a gap or a weakness. Under the common parlance, it has an issue. There's an issue with the control. I know issue is a bit of a loaded term because through my time reviewing a lot of different financial institutions, sometimes issue is interchangeable with risk, sometimes it's interchangeable with breach, sometimes it's interchangeable with incident. Some denomination of a control, weakness, or gap is crucial for this story hanging together. And it's crucial for the common understanding in any business of what it is the problems that are trying to be fixed. Because you want to fix your problems. If you know you have a weakness or a gap in your controls, chances are you want to fix it. You want to get back in business. And that fixing, often referred to as an action. You've got a to-do list of things to fix. You can immediately see here, if you don't know quite what is the issue you're fixing, you can spend a lot of time being busy and active and doing things. If you're not actually busy fixing the control weakness or gap, you're at best adjacent to what's going on. So sometimes we spend a lot of effort and expenditure on looking for issues. So the issue, the control weakness may not be as obvious as the gap in the bridge or the great big falling down element of the bridge into the pit. So looking for problems, looking for hidden issues and weaknesses in the controls. In a common parlance is assurance. So thinking line 2 controls testing, line 3 audit I'd put there, and then testing. So there I'd put BCP testing, pen testing in the tech world, disaster recovery, those sorts of things. You're actively stressing those controls to see if they can withstand the unknown. And then starting to wrap this up, there are times when, despite best efforts, you learn about a control weakness in the worst way possible. And that is typically an incident, something's gone wrong, and you discover the weakness in that control due to the fact that something's gone wrong. And sometimes that brings the regulator, as demonstrated here by a pit viper. I can say that as an ex-APRA, and you have to consider your incident a breach. And so I'd ask the question to the group, just something to reflect on if you don't want to really get into it. Where does your risk framework start? So if you agree to all the points I've just made, the risk framework, the enterprise risk framework should follow something along these 8 points, something similar. The logic should be able to pass a conversation, the pub test, if you will. But as I mentioned at the beginning, if you don't start at objectives and you don't include processes, then beginning at risk is a real disservice to what the business is doing and the reason you have a job. And I'm going to be truly honest here. Most enterprise risk frameworks start at incident and try and work their way backwards. And that's how you end up with spaghetti diagrams of relationships. You end up with fiefdoms of people trying to own more than they should, and you get a poor view of the risk department from others. So we take that as the basics. That's the pattern language with which you want to work to in your business. And also, it's that logic that sets up your enterprise risk management framework. Your data architecture should look pretty similar. So if you stick with me again, I'll walk through this example architecture. So we have process at the top. In the process of doing things, stuff can go wrong. So you go down the right-hand side, you have a risk. You identified a risk. You try and mitigate that risk by implementing a control. If that control isn't working, you have an issue. And should you begin fixing that issue, you have an action, your to-do list of things to do. You can see that you want to make sure your controls are working. So you find that out through assurance and through testing, or you find it out reactively via incidents and breaches. And the mention of breaches there is how the obligation path becomes relevant. So you can see how your risk framework architecture and your data architecture should be almost one and the same. If your language is aligned and commonly understood, then your enterprise risk management framework, your policies and so on, should be reasonably aligned to that logic. And then your data can also align. And that's it. That's the simplicity that makes it work. But from what I saw, about 9 out of 10 financial services companies missed it. They missed the drive for simplification. Data architecture was sold to them by a tech company that want to demonstrate how everything can connect to everything else. Or the data connections aren't there at all and everything is a silo living off in its own world.
So, Paul, I'll just pause you there for a moment. Kirsten has shared in the chat. Thank you, Kirsten. Doesn't it all ultimately need to be with the overarching umbrella of commitment from the top? And I'm going to say to Kirsten, 100%, stick with us. We're getting there in about 5 or 10 minutes, I reckon.
Yeah. Well done, Kirsten. You're
spot on.
Yes is the short answer. Yeah.
Yeah.
And we're
going to talk about that a bit more in a second.
In fact, Kirsten, you thumbs up and hands up, or are you pressing the wrong button? Because I've seen a flurry of activity. Okay, thumbs up. All good. And so I want to make double clear that even though we are talking about the cutting edge of systems and data, that is just a tool in the journey. So really, data is only there to help humans make better decisions. It's not there to replace humans. It's not going to automate away their jobs. It's to help decisions be made with a better, more complete, more timely set of information at their fingertips. I'll give an example. In fact, I'll trace myself back one. Imagine you are a control owner, and every half year, somebody says to you, Pete, does your control work? And you think, well, yeah, I mean, roughly, yeah, it works most of the time. And then you kind of rack your brain a bit and you think, well, did we have an incident last week? Nah. Do we have an incident 3 weeks? Nah. Is there anything going on now? And you kind of do your best to cast your mind back 6 months, but not really, because I mean, we're all humans. Versus me asking Pete that same question. And to hand, he has a log of all the assurance testing, all the audits, all the incidents, all the breaches, all the known weaknesses, and how well they're tracking in terms of being fixed. The answer to the question in the second scenario is so much more advanced, so much more, said with so much more confidence that the two are worlds apart.
And Paul, if I could just add to that,
Yeah.
what does that mean? And I'll throw out it. Some people regard this as a slightly cynical line, but I just think it's the reality of the world. Risk gets you resources. And so in your example, if the first answer is, oh, I think it's okay, well, then we move on and we think about something else. We focus our attention on something else. But if the data is telling us, no, we've actually got an exposure, and that's important, and it's perilling an important objective, they'll get you investment. They'll get you investment in the controls that you need to close that gap. And that's where the rubber really hits the road. So now, by understanding your risk exposure more deeply, by understanding the true value of your controls, when you're identifying those gaps, you've got that such a stronger case for investing in additional control.
100%. Yeah. I mean, I think I hate to come back to this again, but if actions, so right at the bottom there, if actions are the things you do, typically that's going to involve some investment of time, some investment of resource, probably some cash. If you can articulate why the action fixes your control because it remediates the issue, and by fixing the control, your risk exposure is lower, which helps you achieve your objectives, yeah, that investment decision writes itself. Rather than, wow, I suck my thumb and it feels like we're a bit exposed. And do you remember that big thing that happened 18 months ago in France? You're right, that decision is much more evidence. And again, the confidence with which the human can bring information together is where the real value is at.
100%.
I'd also say there's an element of anti-fragility here, so which is, Nassim Taleb's phrase for continuous improvement. So if you can understand how each incident, be large or small, represents the effectiveness of a control, well, then we can see that better companies learn from this bad news. So it's not necessarily it's not great that the bad things happen, but if they're taken as sources of information, they're taken as reasons for looking deeper into the effectiveness of one of, 450 controls, then you can begin to pull together a strengthening in response to the things that are going worse, which, from my reading of Taleb, is the nature of being anti-fragile. So there we've kind of gone through the first two of the 4 tenets, the shared language and then trusted data. And even taking Kirsten's point for one moment, just with an asterisk, just at that point, you can get to insight into your business. And so by that I mean you can start to pull together a GRC system that shows whichever user is involved, what's relevant for them. So it could be the control owner I mentioned earlier. It could be a business unit owner. It could be a board member. It could be someone in audit co. With the trusted data, a common understanding of how the things link, and actually the genuine linkages behind the scenes, you can start to translate a lot of volume of information into what matters and make it visual. There's also an element of risk culture monitoring. So if you're monitoring the data quality amongst those various elements, you can start to see where pockets of risk culture differences exist. We saw this in some of the more advanced entities. So those that were particularly bad at following some of the data quality rules, often that was a lead indicator for a low level of respect for what the risk appetite of the business was. So if you're not there to engage in some of the more administrative tasks, it wasn't necessarily one for one, but it was indicative of poorer behavior later on. And then finally, within insight, you can get a bit of a sense of dependencies within the business. So a top 10 list of controls that do the most demonstrates who is leaning on who. And that's particularly true of those controls that are relied upon over here in my business unit, but actually controlled and owned, or operated and owned over there in Pete's business unit. And that brings some very important questions and conversations, which is, well, Pete, hurry up and fix this thing, because I'm leaning on you to do, I don't know, customer due diligence before I can execute this product. Moving on, oversight. So this is around the. Go on.
Sorry, Paul. Just you know, I'm keen on this whole topic of oversight. Sure. I think this is real rubber hits the road stuff, because this is where, if we've set the table with our deeper understanding of risk, our deeper understanding of our controls, what our real key controls really are, we can start to genuinely say that we are prioritizing our assurance activities, because we really understand where those things need to be focused. So our assurance activities aren't driven by a kind of casual relationship to an organizational risk profile, or perhaps, at the risk of sounding again deeply cynical, the itch that a member of the board audit committee particularly wants to scratch, or, as Paul mentioned before, the thing that happened over there a while ago that may or may not happen to us one day. It's all coming back to a very clear understanding of this is where we need to focus our assurance activity, and this is the reason why, because these are the controls that we are most reliant upon, and in order to achieve our objective. That then flows to that integration piece, and the whole integration of understanding our risks, our risk data, and control effectiveness, and making sure that our policies are consistent with that and reflective of what those most critical controls are, and are supportive of those most critical controls, not in conflict with one another, not in conflict with our risk appetite, but entirely consistent and in harmony. And then that leads again into the whole process of risk administration, and the fact that by really fine-tuning these processes, optimizing these processes, in turn, you are optimizing all those administrative processes that support risk managers, risk owners, your assurance people in the administration and understanding of your risk framework.
Yeah, I like it. And Pete, how many companies have you seen with a budget to match the assurance appetite?
You really want me to say?
Yes, please.
Very few.
Yeah, again, even at the cutting edge, there's always demand outstripping supply. I see Jess has asked a question in the chat, which I will address. So for those who can't see it, can you expand or provide more examples on risk culture monitoring and the role of qualitative drivers in control failures, particularly on actions you've seen address poor risk culture, i.e. control ownership? Yes, absolutely. So thanks for the question, Jess. I'll probably take it in two halves, so two different examples. So if I go back to the control owner and the control attestation point, so common practice in financial services and the more advanced firms is to have a risk and control self-assessment process that whips around the building at least half yearly, sometimes quarterly. And in that, a lot of people sit down and think about their risks and their controls. And I have seen it time and time again. It becomes very administrative very quickly. And control owners are very happy to tick, yes, absolutely, my control works. Don't bother me again because I'm off doing real work. So that is hard to challenge unless the connection to issues, assurance, and incidents are to your fingertips. So you can monitor a bit of a difference between control effectiveness rating as given by the control owner, which is full of bias and human frailties, against either what an independent control tester has found and or a list of the incidents that have befallen underneath that control in the past 3 months. And so where you've got a big discrepancy between the self-assessment and the independent assessment, or between the self-assessment and a ton of open incidents and issues, you may or may not have found something, but it's a very good place to start looking at risk culture in that team or in that environment. And the second one is around the way that control failures are assessed. And this is a bit bleeding edge now. But I did see a company start to use some large language models to cluster incident descriptions. So if you imagine you're in a large business and you're charged with inputting into the system your incident, one of the main boxes to type in is 150, 200 words on what happened and what went wrong. We saw some of the more advanced companies using large language models to comb through those hundreds of small incidents to find how they cluster towards a few controls. And the point to risk culture there is you start to get a sense of, well, who is actively looking for the controls that degrade over time? Who's looking for the controls that die by 1,000 paper cuts, as opposed to the big bang, which is always going to end up with red reports and people's hair on fire. So, Jess, I hope that got to somewhere something useful. But yeah, I've seen some nice overlaps between data insights and risk culture at the higher performing entities. So moving on to the third outcome, so foresight. So with the common language and the structured data, we've seen a lot of advancements in scenarios testing. So trying to look forwards. Simply, if you've got a trusted data in terms of your risk profiling, you can start by choosing scenarios that are going to pick your most vulnerable areas. So if I know I've really got a huge overdue number of control tests in this area, well, then it's probably more profitable to go and scenario test those words. And also the way the scenario testing is executed. So if you can, on a desktop activity, start ramping up likelihood and impact of inherent risks, you keep the control environment the same, it's quite quickly evident how risk exposure changes off the back of that and how that compares to appetite. So then you can start wrapping your scenario testing results to management in a manner that makes sense. And the same comes to simulation and modeling. So simulation tools like to illustrate that kind of cost to appetite curve and forecast that time back to green. So that how long will it take me for my actions to get this thing green again, and therefore the residual risk back in appetite. So you can be a bit more confident again with that trusted data in what you're forecasting forwards. As that's the third of three, I'm going to pause there for any questions or hands or comments. Okay, so moving on. So a reminder of the four tenets and the architecture towards becoming cutting edge. So number one was pattern language. You've got a common understanding of well-defined terms through the business. Number two, your risk framework and your data architecture are aligned to that. And number three, we touched on it in regards to Jess's question. You do need to monitor data quality. It has its own benefits. And then we're going to get now into the human-centered elements. And I'm going to start to crack into Kirsten's question there with the help of Pete.
And I think as well, or as we're doing that, we've got a question from Peter Hanlon, which is to say, how would you amplify the phrase manage in the context of a non-financial risk governance framework? And I think we might touch on that, but we'll make sure we come back to that, Peter. And we've also got a lovely comment from Liz. So thank you, Liz. I'm pleased to see you're enjoying the session so far.
Lovely stuff. How would I amplify the phrase manage? You may have picked up by now, but I'm a bit of a controls geek. So whenever I see the phrase risk management, I think, well, there's only one thing that manages risk, and that's controls. So within a governance framework, I would probably make that same point, which is best you can within conversations. If we're going to manage risk, and risk management frameworks are very much in this space, it would be ensuring we know our control environment, we know whether it's suitable or not, and whether it's doing the job we think it's doing. So I'll try and make it as practical as possible. I know that in governance, there's a temptation to get lost in some kind of the concepts, but to ground it in hard, actionable, real controls is a way that I would amplify in that context. So we're going to move on now to the human-centered element and to the pointers that Kirsten raised slightly earlier. So my biggest shock from leaving the financial services world and leaping into Battleground was how fortunate the financial services firms were to have the CRO role and the line 2 risk function being mandated and required by the regulator. It gives the employees in those positions the role, it gives them the remit, and it gives them protection to keep doing what they're doing. And frankly, it gives them the ability to deliver bad news. But I was quickly made aware that that doesn't exist elsewhere, and I think Pete, you've got some stories in that domain.
Well, this is very true, and I know, speaking for myself, the struggle has been real over the journey, and I have not a shred of doubt that if we've got nearly 100 people on this call, that the struggle is real for, or has been real at times for the vast majority of people on this call. That and it represents itself in where the risk function sits. It represents itself in where in the resource allocation. It represents itself in the time you get on the agendas of the meetings that really matter around the executive table, around the board table, and the board subcommittee table. And so we know that this is where the challenge always lies. And we know, and if I reflect on my own experience, ultimately it does come down to people and the commitment of people in an organisation, starting with the board, driving that through the executive, to create that importance. But it's equally true, I think, and if we go back to some of the things we've been talking about this session today, the demonstration of value. So the whole thing is in a circle. It kind of binds itself together. I need the resources. We need the people. We need the systems to create the insight that demonstrates the value that earns us the seat at the table. And then we marry that with the culture of the so-called independents to deliver bad news, and a quote that was shared with Paul and I just recently, and no one really knows the origin of this one, which is that good news is bad news that travels fast. And that's the culture you want. You want a board and you want an executive that believes that to be true. In our casino example, if the bad news had travelled fast in the first 4 weeks, they wouldn't have lost a cent. If it had travelled up in the first 24 hours, that the control weakness was being exploited, they might have lost a few $100,000. It took 2 weeks, they lost 3 mil. Extrapolate that out on the nature of your organization.
Exactly right. And sticking with the casino example, again, this is public information from the newspapers, but it was reported that the casino's head of investor relations allegedly, and I'll say that intentionally, asked the CFO to bury the losses in the accounts around the time of the company's half-year results. And I mean, that really talks to all sorts of things beyond risk management there, straight into culture and leadership and governance. Thankfully, the CFO said no. So perhaps he or she had the independence required. But if it was maybe a different organization or a different time, that may not have been true. And so what we've got is a conversation that has kind of dragged us towards this desire for change, and the board or very senior representation, they're on board with the board that's on board. They're aligned to the same thinking. And I saw this in financial services through my time with APRA as well, that the approach and attitude towards risk of the board sets the tone. There's a reason tone from the top is so often mentioned. And for those that weren't performing well, they had to change. And we saw time and again that to get from low to high performing, you had to go through the ADKAR framework for change, which was awareness, desire, knowledge, application, so doing it, and then reapplication, so doing it again. And that lasting transformation only sticks if you go through all 5 and you go through all 5 sequentially. And as a bit of a side point, this is exactly the framework I use when I'm coaching the under-10 rugby team that my son plays in. So there's a bit of an awareness point. Like, if you want to score more tries, passing is faster than running it yourself. Desire. Well, I've kind of got to change the boys' desire to have the team score rather than have them score. Knowledge, that's kind of the main bit of coaching. You know, if you're going to pass, do it this way and make sure it's a nice spin and point your hands forwards as you finish. But really, that all falls down until the boys are doing it themselves on a pitch in a game. And not just one game, but every game. And suddenly it's part of who they are and what they do. And I'm stretching the example a touch, but if you don't go through that ADKAR framework, you fall 1 or 2 or 3 stages short, then you don't get a lot of the benefits and the outputs of being a cutting edge organization that we spoke to today.
It's interesting,
so just
Paul,
to round
and I think
out,
it'd be great to just give a moment if people might want to reflect on their experiences in that context of ADKAR. You know, probably the first 2 are the hardest, the awareness and the desire. And then, you know, in the domains we've been talking about, so in the financial services domain, that's driven largely by a compulsion to be compliant, a regulator with a very big stick. But if you don't have that, it makes it that much harder to create those first 2 elements. Sometimes, and I'm sure a lot of people have lived this experience and happy to hear people share, sometimes it's making sure you don't waste your crisis, or ideally don't waste someone else's crisis, even better. Sometimes it's got to start with a bit of fear in this sad reality of this world. But I think we need to be real about that. It's once you can, the really hard bit is getting those first 2 elements. Then you can start to work through other elements.
Yeah, absolutely. It's an uphill battle. Just to pause there because we're going to wrap up now. Putting it back to our case study. So a reminder on the 4 tenets. Hopefully they are sequential and they make sense having had this conversation. So you've got the shared language, you've got the policy, the framework that reflects that, and you also have the data architecture that enables it. That data is trusted because it is verified, it is monitored, and it brings a lot of benefits all in itself. That can bring much more confidence in decisions, either one way or the other. And eventually that fear of being uncertain about why you're asking for something or why you're doing something starts to evaporate because you have that trusted data underneath, and you can talk to that honesty point. But that all does have decisive action implications, both from the board and for the board, or whoever the senior most decision-making body is within your organization. As Pete said, had those automated tellers had the information travel properly, efficiently, and well, it's unlikely that that casino would have lost as much as 3 million. But it could have been 1 million, which is still very bad news, but it's 3 times better than 3 million. So we've now spoken for well over 45 minutes. Very happily open the floor for questions, comments, anything that needs extra explaining or clarity.
And again, be that through the chat or be that through the hand raise. We've clearly left people wondering where the next free money machine is going to be located.
If I knew that, I'd be there already. I wouldn't be on this for a conversation.
We've got some stuff coming through on the chat now at a great rate of knots. Thank you, Sharon, for highlighting the simplicity. I'm glad that message came through because I think simplicity and basics was fundamental. When Paul and I were contemplating what we wanted to talk about today, we were really, really committed to bringing it back to that notion of get the basics right, and then you bought your ticket to play for everything else that can follow and move you towards that cutting edge.
Well, see a bit of a specialist question there from Irfan. I will.
Yes.
I'll come back to that. I'll come to that one now, actually. So, the ideal approach. He asks, or she asks, what should be the ideal approach to map the obligations to the risks and the controls? What I've seen work well is a notion that each obligation needs a control. So, how do I know I'm complying with obligation 1, 2, 3, 4? Oh, it's because I've got 3 controls that monitor it, they catch the bad behavior, and they enforce against it. So I would have a relationship between the obligations themselves and then the controls. In terms of the risk to obligation linkage, personal opinion, I just think obligations are a very detailed explanation of regulatory risk. So fuzzy would be my answer to that one. So precise from controls to obligations, and then fuzzy from risks to obligations.
What we will do, appreciate people's time, and we'll go back through the chat, and if there's things we haven't picked up on, we most definitely will come back to you. Paul, I might just ask you to zoom back in. One of the things we didn't point out, but I hope people noticed on the way through, is we did drop a little QR code on each of our slides.
Oh, yes.
And well, if you're able to just zoom back into that, we would love to keep the conversation going with as many as you as possible. So please, if you haven't, as we've gone through, just before you go off to the next thing, please take a moment to scan the little QR down the bottom right of the slide there, and we'd love to, as I say, we'd love to keep the conversation going.
Well, I see Jess has a detailed question I'm happy to address now. Jess asks, if you identify a control environment is not operating as it should, how have you seen those controls strengthened? Is it revisiting the process, reviewing the data, etc.? I would say it is all of the above. So what was very common and commonly poor was looking to a control that didn't work, assessing why, and stopping at human error. Pete was on the call center and he didn't run the client through a 100-point ID check. Human error. Pete is an idiot. Give him more training. I fundamentally disagreed with that. I think that was a bit of a shallow analysis. And I saw a lot more value in having a deeper dive into the why Pete was able to make that error, or why Peter didn't follow the process in that element. So if your process enables humans to make repeated fundamental errors, my first port of call would be the process. And that marries quite nicely into that point around if you can link together the controls that failed and the kind of a 5 why assessment, you actually know really, really specifically what it is you need to address when you're fixing the thing. So if you know that call center, like the call center operators, their script for identifying somebody only has 50 ID points in, and it keeps causing all these significant errors, well, then you could very easily ask for fundamental changes to the script at a cost of not much that will fix a load of things. So bringing those two kind of circles into a Venn diagram of this control is broken and this is why makes those decisions and those funding requests much clearer, much crisper, and much easier for someone to say yes to.
Just in closing, I just want to acknowledge Kirsten. I think note your comment about having a sole person board. I think there's good and bad in that. You're either going to have an absolute majority or it's going to go the other way. And look, finally, Paul, because I think this is your domain. So Leno asks, and we might use, but this might be our closer. Do you think developing controls from incidents is useful? At my own organization, incidents identify issues and from there establish controls. I would think starting with a risk assessment would help the first step.
I'm going to be unhelpful here and say yes to both. So top down and bottom up.
Yep.
I think it is crucial to respond to identified issues with an improvement in the control environment. So yes, I do think it's useful. As I mentioned, having an incident can be treated as bad news and Pete's in trouble for doing the wrong thing, or it is a piece of information that helps us improve the broader control environment. But then also, ideally, if you understand how your processes work, and again, I'll take you back to that a very early point. If you understand how your processes work, and you consider that incidents are the outcome of processes not going to plan, then the controls fit quite nicely in the middle. So I'd have a kind of process/risk assessment that talks to the controls as the top down, and then responding to identified weaknesses through incidents as the bottom up. So yes and yes.
Fantastic. All right. On that note, I see the clock is about to strike 1:30. So just again, thank you, Paul and myself. We've really enjoyed spending the last hour with 100 odd people on this call, and in particular, thank you for your engagement through your questions, your comments, which have really helped us to be able to hopefully give you a useful and a worthwhile use of your time over your Thursday lunchtime. So thank you so much.
Pleasure. Thank you all.
Bye, everyone.